Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots, cultivating intellect, and shattering cognitive bias. I'm excited today because we're unpacking a framework that has completely changed how millions of people think about wealth.
And I'm here to find out if those millions of people are just, being sold a comforting illusion.
Well, we're looking at Morgan Housel's massively popular book, The Psychology of Money. And the central premise here, the core thesis, is that financial success is not a hard science. It's not dependent on raw intelligence or complex mathematics.
Right.
It is, fundamentally, a soft skill. It's rooted entirely in human behavior, emotion, and psychology. We are taught to think of finance like physics, like structural engineering. You put a very specific amount of stress on a steel beam, and there is universal agreement on exactly when it will snap. It's governed by exact, immutable laws. You input the data into a formula, the formula tells you what the optimal output is, and the result is absolute. It's a very comforting framework.
Sure, on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. But when you step out of a spreadsheet and into the real world of money, you suddenly realize that finance is not physics at all. The bridge breaks not because of gravity, but because the people driving on it panicked, slammed on their brakes, and created a structural failure that literally no equation could have predicted.
And that framing introduces a pretty profound tension, which is what we're digging into today. We are examining whether individual behavioral discipline is truly the primary driver of financial success, and this is my position, whether focusing so intensely on personal psychology is just a convenient way to obscure the overwhelming role of macroeconomic timing, systemic realities, and quite frankly, sheer unpredictable luck.
I will argue that behavioral mastery, specifically cultivating frugality, maintaining a healthy amount of paranoia, and clearly defining what constitutes enough, is absolutely the most critical and actionable lever for wealth generation, regardless of external circumstances.
And I will argue that treating a purely psychological framework as the ultimate driver of wealth is dangerously reductive. It completely ignores the mechanics of how capital actually functions in a complex, deeply unequal economy.
Okay, well, let's look at the foundation of the behavioral argument first, right? Because when it comes to money, behavior simply trumps technical knowledge. And the clearest illustration of this in the book is the juxtaposition of two incredibly different lives, Ronald Read and Richard Fuscon.
Ah, yes, the famous Ronald Read anecdote.
It's famous for a reason. Ronald Read was a rural Vermont gas station attendant and a janitor at JCPenney. He had absolutely zero formal financial education, yet he amassed an $8 million fortune.
Right. And we're supposed to believe he did this just by being patient.
He didn't achieve it by timing the market or having access to elite hedge funds. He did it through extreme patience, extreme frugality, and letting tiny, mundane savings compound over decades. And then on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you have Richard Fusconi. He was a Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive with an MBA. He had all the technical brilliance, the models, the pedigree.
And the access.
Yeah. Yet he went spectacularly bankrupt after the 2008 crisis. Why? Because of greed, massive leverage, and an absolute inability to constrain his lifestyle. It was epitomized by a $90,000 a month mansion.
Wow.
Right? Keeping money requires a specific psychological profile, humility, paranoia, and a definition of enough. And what is so revolutionary, so appealing about this framework is that anyone can cultivate these traits. Financial success is uniquely egalitarian in that way.
I have to stop you there. I really do. Because you are taking an incredibly dark, frankly pathological premise and framing it as some kind of egalitarian virtue.
Pathological? How is humility pathological?
Look at what you're actually praising here. Housel fundamentally romanticizes pathological hoarding and extreme self-deprivation. You're elevating an individual who essentially lived in artificial poverty, scrubbing floors and denying himself any material comfort, merely so he could die with millions of dollars he never used.
He was perfectly happy with his life, though.
Was he? By elevating that as the gold standard, this framework fosters an incredibly toxic, pervasive scarcity mindset. It completely subverts human flourishing. It teaches readers to treat capital as a scoreboard of ascetic self-denial, rather than a utilitarian tool for actual living.
That's entirely mischaracterizing the point. It's about not letting your ego outpace your income.
Now, it is promoting a paranoid, joyless existence where every spent dollar is viewed as a failure of discipline. But even if we ignore the dismal ethics of that, we have to talk about the total lack of scientific rigor here.
Lack of rigor. He cites behavioral economics constantly.
He relies on empirically bankrupt psychological science. The whole premise hinges on concepts like ego depletion and psychological priming,
Which are foundational concepts in psychology.
which have spectacularly failed massive academic replication attempts. Roy Baumeister's entire theory of ego depletion, the idea that willpower is this finite resource you can drain, has been debunked. Massive multi-lab replication studies found zero effect.
Well, the exact mechanism of willpower might be debated.
It's not debated, it's failed. And using that flawed science to prop up the Ronald Read anecdote is absurd. You're elevating Read as a blueprint, but statistically, he is a literal lottery winner.
I completely reject the premise that Ronald Read is a lottery winner. That fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism of compounding.
Oh, I understand compounding. I also understand survivorship bias.
Let me explain. Compounding is highly unintuitive to the human brain, right? We think linearly. If I take one step a day for 30 days, I move 30 steps. But compounding is exponential. If you double your step size every day for 30 days, you circle the globe multiple times. Read is just the mathematical result of allowing that exponential curve to run its course without interruption.
By getting incredibly lucky.
No, by conquering his ego. Savings is defined as the gap between your ego and your income. Reed survived. He mastered the psychology of survival. And that psychological discipline is exactly what conquers the structural disadvantages you keep pointing to.
Look at the actual numbers. In 2014, the year Ronald Read died, over 2.8 million Americans died. Fewer than 4,000 of them had a net worth over $8 million. He was a 1 in a million tail event.
He was an outlier because most people lack the discipline.
No, he was an outlier because of fat-tailed variants. To hold him up as a replicable model is actually dangerous when you look at how public markets function. Look at the data on the Russell 3000 index, which represents, the vast majority of investable U.S. equities.
Okay.
From 1980 onward, 40% of all companies in that massive index lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered. 40%.
Right, which proves my point.
How does that prove your point? Most public companies are duds. They fail. If you're an ordinary person relying on picking blue chip stocks and just being patient, you are exposing yourself to massive tail risks. Reed happened to pick the right ones and live long enough for the tail to wag the dog. It wasn't his lack of ego that picked winning stocks. It was sheer luck.
You're completely missing the core function of his behavior in that exact scenario. The fact that 40% of companies fail catastrophically is precisely why psychology matters more than stock picking.
Psychology doesn't save a bankrupt company.
No, but the antidote to that tail risk is the margin of safety. It's the room for error you deliberately build into your life. Reed succeeded precisely because his extreme frugality gave him massive shock absorbers. He bought a 2-bedroom house for $12,000. He chopped his own firewood.
Again, pathological hoarding.
It gave him a margin of safety. His lifestyle was so inexpensive that he was completely insulated from the tail risks you're pointing out. When those companies in the Russell 3000 crashed, he was never forced to sell his assets to cover his living expenses. The psychology of frugality allowed him to survive the volatility.
But your definition of a margin of safety assumes the investor's baseline reality is stable enough to build one in the first place. The ability to endure bear markets and hold assets is heavily dictated by macroeconomic sequence of returns risks and generational timing, which is the literal definition of pure luck.
Generational timing is a factor, sure, but
It's the only factor that matters. Consider an investor born in 1950. The stock market went absolutely nowhere during their teens and 20s, adjusted for inflation. It was functionally flat during the most impressionable years of their life. precisely when they were supposed to be building that precious compounding engine.
Yes, and that's unfortunate, but
Conversely, if you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold during your teens and 20s. An individual's willingness to bear risk depends almost entirely on their personal macroeconomic history. It's the dumb luck of when and where you were born. You cannot out-psychology a flat decade. If the market yields nothing during your peak saving years, your psychological shock absorbers are totally irrelevant.
that argument assumes that winning the financial game means achieving the absolute highest mathematical return possible. Generational luck is undeniably real. I'm not disputing that. But recognizing that you can't control the macroeconomic weather is precisely why a psychological framework is necessary.
It doesn't fix the weather.
But it changes how you dress for it. The goal isn't to be coldly, mathematically rational. The goal is to be reasonable. Consider Harry Markowitz. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing modern portfolio theory, the mathematically optimal way to balance risk and return.
Right.
But when it came to his own personal money, Markowitz admitted he didn't use his Nobel-winning formulas. He split his money 50-50 between stocks and bonds. Why? Because his actual goal was to minimize future regret. He just wanted to sleep well at night.
Okay. Optimizing for sleep. Great.
Yes, because adapting to your own generational luck, whether you face the flat market of the 1970s or the bull market of the 1990s, and making choices that prevent behavioral panic, that is a psychological skill. It's not a structural defeat to experience a bad market.
I understand optimizing for sleep and minimizing regret. But that perspective completely glosses over the fact that sleeping well at night is a luxury born of massive systemic privilege.
How is saving money a privilege?
Let's evaluate how wealth is actually defined in this framework. The book argues that wealth is what you don't see, right?
Correct. Wealth is unspent assets. It's the $100,000 car you deliberately chose not to buy. The highest dividend money pays is the ability to control your time.
And that is exactly where this entire framework collapses. It is dangerously myopic. It presents a framework applicable only to a highly privileged, weird demographic, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic.
I don't think that's fair. Controlling your time is a universal desire.
The desire is universal. The ability is not. The advice to just save, skip luxury purchases, and to control your time assumes a baseline level of systemic access and income that simply does not exist for millions of people. Let's look at the actual systemic realities. In November 2009, the nationwide unemployment rate was roughly 10%.
Right, during the Great Recession.
Yes. But for African American males aged 16 to 19 without a high school diploma, the unemployment rate was 49%. For Caucasian females over 45 with a college degree, it was 4%. That is not a difference in psychological discipline. That is a gaping chasm in structural reality.
I'm not saying systemic inequality doesn't exist.
By claiming individual behavior trumps all other factors, Housel effectively erases the reality of systemic inequality and the racial wealth gap. Look at the macroeconomic shifts post-1980s. Between 1993 and 2012, the top 1% saw their incomes grow by 86%. The bottom 99% saw just 6.6% growth.
Which makes personal saving even more crucial.
You're committing a massive logical fallacy of false causality. Without institutional access to capital, behavioral discipline is utterly useless. When you tell a generation facing stagnant median wages, soaring education costs, and structurally embedded unemployment that their financial salvation lies in psychological restraint, you are engaging in systemic victim blaming.
No, that is not victim blaming. The material does not claim that everyone starts at the same baseline. But we have to look at what variables are actually within an individual's control. We cannot individually reverse macroeconomic wage stagnation, right? We can't change the decade we were born into.
So we just pretend those things don't dictate our lives?
No, but precisely because the system is so unforgiving and structurally imbalanced, your psychological relationship with money is literally the only defensive tool you have left.
And telling a drowning person to just think differently about water is absurd. You cannot mathematically sever your ego from your income if your income is zero. The concept of wealth as unspent assets is fundamentally meaningless if you have no assets to hide.
I just think there is profound value in maintaining an internal locus of control. Building a margin of safety, however small it might be, it's not just a virtue for the privileged, it's a survival mechanism for navigating a chaotic system. Cultivating humility, avoiding ruinous debt.
No. Stop right there. There is no value in intellectualizing structural failure as a personal deficiency. When people fail to build wealth over a lifetime, it is not because they lacked the humility to scrub floors like Ronald Reed. It is because they were hit by fat-tailed variants they couldn't absorb. It's because immense systemic barriers dictated their trajectory far more than any psychological framing ever could.
But if we just surrender to the structure,
Then we actually deal with reality. This book is essentially a vehicle for systemic victim blaming, wrapped in folksy anecdotes. It acts as a blinder to the overwhelming structural realities of how capital actually clusters and excludes in the modern world, and we refuse to accept that blinder. Listeners, you need to use this knowledge to build your mental immunity against these kinds of comforting, reductive narratives. Don't forget to subscribe to Cognitive Dose.